Hello and welcome to The Writer's Mindset with me, Christina Adams.
And me, ALLi.
Each week, we're here to help you persevere through the tough times, be your most productive self, and get that work in progress published.
Wherever you are in your publishing journey, we've got your back.
This week, we're talking to Shane Millar all about plotting.
Big shout out to our podcast patrons for all of your support.
As a patron, you'll get early access to episodes, the chance to submit questions for our guests, and access to our bonus series, Healthy Habits.
Healthy habits isn't your typical productivity advice. We're not here to tell you to get up at 4 a.m. and go for a 3-hour run.
Hell no. We're exploring the latest research to find small changes you can make in your life to be happier, healthier, and more productive in your writing life and beyond.
To start developing healthier habits today, come join our community at patreon.com/writersmindset.
Do you want to write 50,000 words in 30 days? The 50k Writing Camp has got you covered. This November, join dozens of authors making their dreams a reality. Weekly live writing sprints with international best-selling author Daniel Wilcox. A group word tracker to help keep you on goal. An online community of your fellow writers. All your Writerly and Author Life questions answered. And new for 2023, a 1-month free subscription of Activated Authors. Head on over to www.activatedauthors.com/50k to secure one of the limited spots today.
With us today is our lovely friend and patron, Shane Millar. Welcome back to The Writer's Mindset.
Thank you for having me back on.
So today we are talking about a topic that actually is now one of my favorites. And I'm not going to lie, like 18 months ago, it was panic attack inducing. So I think this could be a fun chat. So we are talking about plotting. Before we dive into that, could you just give our readers, I'm really not with it today. I just want to preface with that. It's a stressful week. I'm going to talk a lot of crap.
It is all good.
So you've obviously done an insane amount since you and Ellie caught up in, what was it, May, June?
Yes, May, I think. May or June, one of the others.
So can you just let our listeners know a little bit about you and what you've been up to since we last got up?
Sure can. So, like Christina said, I'm Shane, and in terms of my writerly journey, I wrote my first urban fantasy novel way back in 2010. Then I did what most writers do, stuck it in a drawer for the best part of a decade because I fell into a quote-unquote sensible corporate job, which turned out not to be so sensible. I found that manuscript in late 2018, and it was bad. I mean, the worst thing you've ever read. It will never see the light of day without a ton of rewrites. Anyway, I spent the next couple of years learning everything I could about the writing craft and the business of being an author. I published my first 4 urban fantasy novels this year, and I've now also published 4 books for writers this year as well. So yeah, you're right, I have been very, very busy. And I think the 5th one will be out, the writing guide, by the time this airs, but I don't know. So that's pretty much what I've been up to since I last spoke to ALLi. Lots of publishing, lots of launch, and I'm very tired.
Lots of stuff. Like, wow. Round of applause for you. That is insane.
Thank you. Oh, I'm launching a podcast too with my wonderful co-host Cassie Newell. So that might also be out by the time this airs. I don't know.
This will be October time that it goes live.
Yeah, then it will be out.
Do you want to give it a quick plug?
Yeah, sure. So it is the Storytellers Face Off podcast. Like I said, I am presenting with my co-host Cassie Newell. We're both book coaches. I'm an editor and she is a book coach in terms of idea generation. And each week we answer a question put to us by our listeners all about the writing craft. And this season is focused on, funnily enough, the writer's mindset. Imagine that.
You're going to get some juicy ones, I'll bet.
Yeah, we've had some, we've done some pre-recording. We've had some pretty good ones. So
nice. Far. I can't wait to give it a listen. What date does it start?
It drops on October 1st.
Very nice. Yes, it will be live then by the time this episode goes out. So definitely check it out once you've listened to this.
Thank you very much.
So one of your nonfiction books is on plotting.
Yes.
I'm curious to know what you feel the benefits of plotting are for us, regardless of kind of what genre we're writing or where we are in our journey.
Yeah, I think the major benefit of plotting for me, and this is something I learned having written that terrible novel with no outline back in 2010, is that it gives you a process that you can follow to produce the best story you can every time you start a new project. Note, I don't say the most perfect story. There is no such thing. Just the best story that you're capable of producing. So when I talk about plotting or anything I outline before I start my first draft, I'm basically focused on three things. That is character, the plot in terms of story beats. So we all know these: the inciting incident, the midpoint, the darkest moment, all of those things. And just some brief notes on setting, so that you know that the settings you choose or the locations you choose will have some good emotional impact for the reader and your characters. And I think, like I said, the major benefit here is that it gives you a roadmap that you can follow before you start. So I always equate it to revising for an exam. For example, I don't know about you, but I would not go into an exam without preparing before I start or before the exam itself, because you wouldn't have a clue how to answer any of the questions, and that wouldn't be a good thing. It'd be very stress inducing. Writing a book is basically the same. The thought of, for me anyway, sitting down to discovery write with no outline is terrifying because of how awful that first book was, and I never wanted to make that mistake again. So even with a really basic outline where you've just filled in a few details about character, about the story arc, and about the setting, I find it helps you get through your first draft a lot quicker because you're not sat there wondering what you need to do next. And the best thing is that when you've written your first draft, you'll have the very sort of skeleton foundation of a great story arc that you can take into your edit. And that in itself makes editing a lot less stressful. So they're the major benefits for me. It's just having that plan so that you know what's happening next.
Yeah, the first time I like properly outlined something in depth, not the crazy depth that some people do, but like more depth than I ever did, the process felt easier. And I had like the setting detail and the characters and the kind of arc and stuff. And it was the first book I'd actually ever written in chronological order. And then I only did one pass through before I sent it to beta readers. And I'm like, this is like too easy. It's like they're going to hate it. No, they don't hate it.
Yeah, exactly. And then you kind of think, oh, maybe I missed something huge because I can't only do one or two passes.
Yeah.
I've missed something. But yeah, I just think it's helpful to lay those foundations so that at least when you have edited, the foundation of that story is strong. And I think that's the major thing I take away from plotting, is that readers read for story at the end of the day. And if you can produce a decent story, they'll forgive anything else. They'll forgive, a few typos or a badly constructed sentence. What they won't forgive is a story that lacks direction or character arc, for example.
Why do you think some authors don't plot despite all those benefits?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. And I'm like you, I did resist plotting for a long time because I had that whole mindset of, you cannot boil the sacred art of fiction writing down to a process. How dare you? This is my creative outlet. This is the thing I do to unwind. And I think that's what it comes down to. So most writers, I think, believe that plotting will kind of suck the creativity out of the whole writing process. And I could make an argument that if you are a really deep outliner and you've got, those 100-page massive outlines, that probably is the case. You've told yourself the entire story already. You probably don't want to tell yourself that story again. So I can see how that could suck the fun out of drafting if you go on into a really deep outline, because you'd know everything before you start. But what I'm talking about and the type of plotting that I reference in my book is just getting those kind of tent poles, the major scenes planned out, so that you know where the major emotional turning points are. You know where you're going to have your character react to something big that's happened to them. And then you've got all that space in between those major key plot beats to kind of play and discovery write and do all the things that still make plotting creative. So plotting doesn't have to be, this scene's going to be about this, and then the next one's about this, the next one's about this. It can just be, get the foundations of the story in place and have fun with the rest. I think that's why people resist it, because it can suck the fun out if you go too deep, I think.
I've definitely heard that argument before, and I've spoken to a lot of people, and I'm sure you've come across this as well. A lot of people are like, I'm going to write a book one day and it's going to be like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones kind of thing. And it's like so big and vast. And then they do so much world building. They've actually not got any time or energy or brain space or fucks left to write the actual story.
Yeah. I've definitely been there. Definitely been there. For me
personally, like, it wasn't because I saw it as less creative. It was because my brain is averse to being organized. It's an internal battle I have that it's probably an ADHD thing. One day I'll get an official diagnosis when I'm grey. And it was like this wall came up when I started to think about plotting that I could not get past. And it was last summer when we started interviewing people, and when I had like a really stressful time working on Hollywood Heartbreak, that I realized the benefits of it and how I could come up with a system that was much more in depth and much more streamlined and would actually make the writing process calmer and less stressful for me. And I think as stressful as last summer was for me, having to go back through and read books I hadn't plotted to refamiliarize myself with certain things, it was actually beneficial because it really opened my eyes. And then I managed to write the Mean Girls murder so quickly. But then I kind of regressed slightly and tried to imitate the same process, but I was missing the setting element that you mentioned, and also some of how certain things happen. And I find that knowing the how allows me to focus much more on making the dialogue funny or sexy or whatever it needs to be, when I'm not thinking about that. Because book 6 in the series will be set on a cruise ship. And I've never been on a cruise ship. So trying to visualize that alongside everything else, I think if I'd put those little notes into the outline, it would have made things a lot easier when doing that first draft. But even so, I've still got that framework and I know what I'm writing towards, and it makes the process so much easier.
And you make a really interesting point about how people's brains are wired, because we're told that this is the way to do something. So how many times have you heard, you must plot like this, or you must edit like this? Now, I don't believe in that either, particularly because we're all different. The best thing to do when you come across a plotting process, whether it be Save the Cat, whether it be mine, is to take the parts of the process that you think will actually work for you. Because like you said, if you have a brain that naturally resists organization, you are not going to be the type of person that writes, 100 plus page outlines. You're probably going to be the type of person that has a general idea of where the story is going to go and still leave yourself room to be disorganized in the middle. So yeah, you make a really valid point about process and the way we can be wedded to a process even when it's not really working.
And I think the thing I've certainly noticed is that it doesn't matter how many books I've written or how many series I've done, every single one is different.
Yeah.
I started writing a new series recently, and I feel like I'm learning to write all over again because it's different. It's like, it's not as hard as when I went to write fantasy. It's not that aspect that's hard.
Yeah.
Getting to know the characters again and finding ways to show their personality, and remembering the fact that I often forget to include subplots in my outline.
Me too.
Which I've sort of included them, but this is where the how comes in. Like, I've got this note about showing someone being like really mardy about the fact that his mom's got a new boyfriend, but I haven't shown how he shows that he's in a bad mood and disapproves of this guy. And so that takes extra brain power to figure out. And if I'd done that during outlining, I could have like rolled out of bed and written 1,000 words without my brain fully switching on, because I'm tapped more into that subconscious.
Yeah, exactly.
What would be your advice to a writer who is averse or afraid to plot?
Okay, so the best piece of advice I can give on this is that we've kind of touched on it already, but plotting means different things to different writers. And most people have a fixed idea of what plotting is. I think people see plotting as that really in-depth, I have to sit down, I have to know exactly what's happening in every scene, I have to know every beat, I have to know every move my character's going to make before they make it. And that can be really daunting. And I think that's the attitude I first had when I tried to plot as well. I thought, well, if I don't plot everything, I'm never going to know how to finish this story. And that is a huge roadblock, and it's a form of resistance to the process. So again, if we look at plotting on a really basic level, all you need is some key facts about your protagonist and some of your major side characters, potentially. Just those key important beats that we all know from 3-act story structure. I am not sharing anything new here. 3-act story structure has been around since the dawn of time, practically. And we know story. We watch so many movies, we read so many books, we have internalized most of it already. So the good thing to know as well is that instinctively you will know how to plot. It might just be that you need to internalize the full process. And then just those key things about setting. I always, when it comes to setting, I'll say to myself, so what 5 things can my characters see here? What can they hear? What can they smell? All of those 5 basic senses that you include in a scene. And then at least when you sit down to write, you know how you're going to bring that scene to life. And that's really all you need to get started. So if you are one of those writers who's really resistant to plotting, know that it doesn't have to be this massively scary, in-depth, horrendous thing. It can just be the basics. And once you've got those basics internalized, you'll know how to do them, and you can take that knowledge with you to every single project you start. So that's what I would say. Try not to make it a really big, daunting process.
I'm so going through and adding in all the sensors to my outlines that are waiting to be written, because that would make it so much easier for the description side of things.
Yeah,
I
and
never
it
thought
doesn't.
that.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be huge things. Just I do like five sights, 5 sounds, 5 smells, and then do the 5 senses, and then at the end I'll probably do 5 emotions that my protagonist could potentially feel in this place, just so that the setting links to character as well, because your character is what it's all about, really.
Exactly. What pitfalls have you noticed writers fall into when they don't plot?
I fall into many of these myself.
We've all been there. We've all been there.
Yes, we have all been there. So I've already told you about this horrendous first novel that I wrote that I didn't outline. I just sat down and I wrote. And I think what most people find, myself included, is that when you read it back, it's just a pile of words, or at least a pile of unconnected scenes that don't really form a cohesive story. And I'm not saying there won't be salvageable bits. Of course there will. Nobody's that terrible a writer that nothing can be salvaged, but characters will, my characters particularly felt so flat. They all sounded the same, and they all sounded like me, which is not great for character creation. As I've said, no storyline. It's just a collection of vignettes or scenes that don't really make sense when you put them together. And most importantly, the locations and the setting, it's like I plucked them from anywhere. They didn't have any emotional impact. They weren't related to the story in any way, really, and they weren't that well described, because I think people think of world building and they instantly think fantasy, but even if you're a contemporary romance author, you're going to have to world build. Yes, everyone knows what a coffee shop looks like, but do they know what your coffee shop looks like? They're the things that bring your story to life in a way that aren't generic and that can really immerse readers in the story. So they're the pitfalls. It comes down to flat characters, flat story, and flat settings.
I was reminded yesterday when I had a call with GM White, who we've had on to talk about cover design, about one of my sort of famous stories among listeners of this podcast, which is Poppy Winslow and how she finds out who the murderer was. And I hadn't written on my post-it note who the murderer was. And I think the problem with that was I wasn't familiar enough with the structure of a crime story, because every genre has slightly different things.
Yeah.
Like fantasy has one thing, romance has another, and yes, you can layer them, but you need that individual understanding as well. I had no understanding of writing a crime novel, and like for some people, they can find out who the murderer is at the end, and that's fine, and they've laid all these breadcrumbs. I laid no breadcrumbs at all.
Yeah.
I had no idea who the murderer was. It changed 3 times because I didn't know, and in the end, it ended up being the main character who was an unreliable witness the whole time, which sounds like a really good twist, but it was one of the worst things I've ever written, genuinely. Like the story, the characters were fine. The actual plot was just drunk.
Yeah.
There's no other way to put it.
And that's a good point too. It's not just learning the basics of plotting. There are genre specific things. And in the book, I do try and draw examples from many, many different genres. So, the inciting incident in a romance, which is going to be a meet cute where the love interests meet for the first time, is not going to be the same as an inciting incident in a thriller, which might be that, I don't know, the protagonist's entire family gets murdered. Although we use the same terminology to describe these things, the genres do have their own expectations that we should adhere to if you're actually wanting to sell and market your books. And
if you don't adhere to them, they will lynch you, especially if you write romance or sell it as romance. They will. Like, that's just a fact.
Yeah, very true.
When it comes to putting together the actual plot, what would you say is the most important aspect to focus on?
Yeah, so this might sound bizarre, but the most important thing to focus on when you plot is character. Character is the most important thing about story. Readers don't really care about the plot itself. So the gunfights, the arguments, the car chases, they only really care about those things because they're happening to a character that they relate to, or at least that they can identify with in some way. So the first thing I do when I sit down to plot is I outline what I call the 5 foundations of a relatable protagonist. And those foundations are a wound. So this is an event that has damaged your main character, either physically, mentally, or emotionally in their past. I then give them a scar, which is the resulting emotional baggage left behind by that wound. In other words, it's their flaw or their flawed belief about themselves. I give them a want, which is the external thing they're pursuing in the story. A desire, it could be, I don't know, in a heist movie, they're after a particular painting or whatever, that kind of thing. Then you give your character a need, which is the transformative lesson that they need to learn by the end of the novel to take them from that flawed place that they open in to a semi-healed place at the end of the novel, or at least a better version of themselves than they were at the start. And then the final thing I give them is something unique. That could be a skill, a symbol, a talent, something that only belongs to them. And if you do that, the great thing is that you've kind of got your plot already starting to form, because you know you need to take your character from this flawed place at the start to a changed place at the end, and your plot will help you inform that. So say, for example, your character their flaw is that they're massively afraid of conflict, and by the end of the novel you want them to be in a place where they're comfortable engaging in conflict. You would then be throwing plot events at them that force them to engage in conflict the entire way through the novel. I mean, you should be doing that anyway, because conflict is massively important, but in this example specifically. And then as the novel progresses, they will slowly begin to deal with conflict, and then by the end they should be actively engaging in conflict. So that's one example. But if you've got the basics of your character down, I think that informs a lot about your plot and the types of events that you need to throw at your character in order to make them change.
Totally agree. One thing that I found really helpful, and it was an amalgamation of your interview with ALLi and when we talked to Sasha Black both times, that helped me with my new series. I say series. Can I call it a series if it's a duology?
You can call it what you want. Yes,
that point, it's not even published yet, so who knows? Like, Hollywood Gossip was meant to be 1 book and it turned into 6, so could be anything at this point. But like, I found writing down the theme and which aspect of the theme each character represents really helps me. And I'd never done anything that in depth before, but it really helped to bring out the characters' personalities and how some of them are desperate to be loved and some of them resist love because they think it's a bad thing. And that really brought them to life in my head, and from that I could like work out their physical descriptions and how they dressed and how they styled their hair, because those little things do influence how people look and how people behave.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, if you know that a character is resistant to love at the start of the novel, the whole point of the plot is then going to be to get them to a space where they're comfortable to open up to love or something similar. Exactly. So you can already start to think, oh, my inciting incident, obviously that's a romance, so it'd be some kind of meet cute, but you start to realize what types of events you can throw at them to force that change in a way that feels organic.
Exactly. I'm going to put you on the spot a bit here.
Yeah, go for it.
Do you have any examples from, could be books, could be film, TV, games, etc., of any characters where you go, they nailed it?
Yeah, I do. So yeah, I do. So the one I always bring up is Katniss from the Hunger Games. And whether you enjoyed those books or not, whether you think that the author handled the plot well or not, because I've heard many authors particularly debate this ad nauseum, but Katniss is a great character. So she has the wound. Her father died in a mine explosion when she was 12. This has left her bitter, tough, surly, all of those things that she is at the start of the novel. Her scar is that she finds it hard to let people in because her mother neglected her and her sister. Her sister she will let in because that's a save the cat moment that comes later. Her desire or her want is to win the Hunger Games because she is forced to volunteer to take her sister's place. Her sister makes her promise to try really hard, so she feels like she has to. Her need is to, in some respects, learn to let people in. So the whole subplot of that novel is her love story with Peter and her trying to decide whether it's real or not. And she can't do that because she has trouble reading people's emotions because of the neglect that she suffered from her mother. And then her uniqueness, although there are other characters who use bows and arrows in the story, she is the one person who can use a bow and arrow to devastating effect, and not some fancy souped up bow and arrow either, just a bog standard bow and arrow. And the thing that Suzanne Collins, or her editor, whichever one it was, did really cleverly was tie her uniqueness to her wound. So her dad is the person who taught her to shoot. Pretty much every time she uses a bow and arrow, she thinks of her wound, which causes all sorts of plot complications. So that's a really great example for me of a character who's really well designed.
And it's so beautifully layered as well. Like, you're not analyzing all of that when you're reading it, but then you kind of look back or reread it, and that's when you notice the depth that her character has. And I do think some of the characters don't come across quite as well in the film as they do in the books. I love the films, but like certain things, like what happens with Peter, for example, I don't like film Peter. I'm just going to put that out. Anyway, we have a really interesting question here from Jeff, who I mentioned earlier, and he wants to know what the best way to plot is so that you can draft more quickly / efficiently.
Yes, that is a brilliant question. So the best tip I can give is not to overthink your plot. And I don't say this because you don't need to come up with gripping plot twists and all those things, because you do have to do that. I say it because it doesn't matter how much you plot. There will always come a point where you deviate from your outline at some point during the novel. Now, this can be different for everyone. I think it's as you get to know your characters better, the thing that you originally planned for them to do doesn't necessarily then fit with the person that they become as the story moves on. So for me, I always get to the midpoint of the novel, and something about that always forces me outside of my outline, which inevitably means that I have to discovery write the next quarter of the book up to the all is lost moment before going back and kind of reverse engineering that section of the book to make the new stuff fit. And that might involve going right back to the start and adding other stuff in. But yeah, so when you write your outline, as when you write your book, don't aim for perfection because it will never be perfect. All you're really doing when you outline is telling yourself a really condensed, rough version of the story so that you can get started. So I think the main tips I can give to outline effectively are know that you're not going to be wedded to the outline and that it probably will change. And also, don't be scared to deviate from your outline. Don't think that because you've written something down, it's set in stone, because the only time it's really set in stone is after you've published. And if you're an indie author, it's not really even set in stone then, because you can always go back and rewrite.
Do you come across writers very often who are like, this is in my outline, I've got to follow it, even though it doesn't feel very natural and it feels very forced, and like they're trying to turn the story into what it was rather than what it wants or needs to be?
Yeah, I've definitely worked with some editing clients where that has been an issue in terms of, oh, this is the story I saw in my head, so this is the one I'm telling. And I don't know if it's a mindset thing, but I think people get a block of, oh, but if I deviate from the outline, what if the new stuff is not as good as the stuff I put in the outline? And that's usually not the case, because you know more about your story by the time you're halfway through your draft. So, you know, we've all heard that old thing about the first idea isn't necessarily the best idea. And I think that's what happens when you draft from an outline. You'll get to a certain point and you'll think, oh, but that could be so much better. And then a part of you holds back and thinks, oh, but my outline's pretty good already. So what happens if I completely stuff it up? You won't stuff it up, because at the end of the day, you can draft that novel as many times as you like before you're happy with it. But yeah, I have certainly come across that thing where people get so stuck into their outline that that's all they can see. And then they'll get to a point where, I've done it myself. Like when I first started plotting, I got to that midpoint point. It completely threw me off. And I didn't write for about, I don't know, 3 weeks, because I was thinking, oh, I'm stuck now because this doesn't fit my outline. So yeah, don't take it too seriously. You're literally just telling yourself a rough version so that you can start, rather than this is set in stone.
It's like you're jumping off the diving board when you do the plot or the outline, and then you start writing, and that's when you hit the water, and it's whether you sink or swim.
Yeah, completely. That is exactly right.
I just came up with that on the fly. I'm quite pleased.
You should use that.
I should. I don't really do sports. I'm only into the F1, but hey, let's go with it. You saying that actually reminded me of something. I was talking to Ellie a couple of weeks ago about my new series, and like, I want to write it, but I don't want to write all of these meeting new people scenes. I just want to get to it because for me, the story isn't how people meet; it's how they stay together. That's the side of the psychology that I'm interested in, and that's why like my books sort of fit into romance, sort of don't. And I was talking to her about it, and when I was talking to her, I had this epiphany, and it was that I should start halfway through rather than trying to start from the beginning, because then I can skip all those meet cutes. Because for every single one of my series, I have rewritten the meet cutes 3 or 4 times. That doesn't include editing. That's literally just starting from scratch. I've ended up redoing them. And I've got like my main character goes to Australia, so she knows like 2 people. So you can imagine how many people she meets at the start.
Yeah.
And last night, I've got about 22,000 words on the book so far, not including the first 10 chapters. They're not done yet. And last night, I came up with a really good scene to introduce her work colleagues. And just because I had kept myself open and flexible and spent that time getting to know the characters once they were kind of established relationships, I feel like now it's going to be easier to write the introduction with them. And actually, if I can pull it off, I've forgotten half the dialogue, but it was a really funny scene where her boss is like completely scatterbrained and all over the place. And the guy who becomes her best friend is like the sane one in this madhouse, basically. But it's a room full of writers. You can imagine what it's like. And if I had been forcing myself to do something very regimented, then I don't think I would have been able to come up with a scene like that would have immediately thrown you into who these characters are.
Yeah, I agree. And that's kind of what we were talking about earlier. So when I say outline, I don't mean you have to sit down and plan the hook, the inciting incident in order. You don't have to do that. So if there's a particular part of the story that you know is inspiring for you, so for you that, like you said, you're more inspired by what keeps people together than how they actually meet. And then you can write a decent meet cute based on what you learn once they're together. That makes complete sense. So you don't have to outline in order. You can pick any scene you like and start there. And it is about finding a process that works for you. Ultimately, that's how you're going to make plotting, writing, editing the fastest you can. You have to do what works for you.
I think it's a real process of trial and error, and that can be a little bit intimidating. I think if you're open to the openness, that doesn't make sense.
Yes, it
you
does.
Know what I mean, though, don't you?
Weirdly, it does. Yeah.
You've got to be open to just like running with the madness, like my characters.
Yeah.
Like being a dog chasing its tail, or being a dog running through a field, or maybe not running down a main road without a lead on. That's not safe.
No, that's probably not a good thing.
You've just got to be as flexible as possible, and not like, you don't even have to trust yourself per se. You just have to be like, yeah, fuck it.
Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned Sacha Black earlier. I've heard her refer to her drafting process before as like a chaos draft. So it doesn't have to be, she owns that. She is fully happy to admit that her drafts are chaos because that's what works for her. And she's discovered that now. She's not trying to, force herself to follow a particular process step by step. And that is one of the most important things you can do. Once you realize that there is no perfect process, is what I'm trying to say, it really frees you up to be creative. So if you're worried about, I can't plot because it's not creative, well, you found a way to plot your romances more creatively in a way that works for you. Sasha's found a way to draft in a way that works for her, that keeps her interested. So it doesn't have to be that you take every single element of somebody's process and run with it and you can never kind of deviate or step off that plate. You can adapt and change things until they suit you. And I think you raised a valid point about the trial and error thing can be very nerve-wracking, because I think you get to a certain point when you're writing just before you actually know what you're doing, which is never. So I don't know. Yeah, never know what we're doing.
I'm glad it's not just me.
Nope. Before you get to a certain point, at least, where you've internalized some of this stuff, you start questioning, why aren't these processes working for me? They work for XYZ person. They probably don't. What's happened to XYZ person is that they've taken the basics of that plotting structure, or I don't know, the drafting process or the Pomodoro method or whatever we're talking about to help us write faster. And they've adapted it to suit them. they say that that's the process that works for them. So I said for years, Save the Cat really works for me, and it does, but with some adjustments, which is the kind of byproduct of this book.
I don't know if you've noticed this, but I found that every genre I write, the process is different. My nonfiction books, I always planned in a lot of depth, but then I would like move sections around based on what flowed better. With what happens in books, I didn't really plot them that much. I had like a bullet pointed list of scenes, and I would usually start with the kind of moments of highest tension and write those, and then weave everything else around it like a jigsaw. And it wasn't until I started writing fantasy and was really pushed on the world building by ALLi and Alexa Whitewolf that I was like, shit, I need to be more organized here.
Just a shout out for Alexa. She's actually my fiction editor and she's fantastic.
She is. She's brilliant.
But yeah,
I forgot she was your editor. I completely forgot.
Yeah.
Small world.
Is. I know.
She knows her fantasy stuff better than a lot of people. She's so good on fantasy. Don't forget to check out our episode with her on world building, because
no, don't.
You might hate her at the end, but like she asked me some really hard questions because cover your ears if you don't want spoilers for Afterlife Calls. But at the end of book 1, there is a demon, and the demon hasn't yet come back because this is going to be like a 15-book series.
Yeah.
And she was like, well, how does this work for the demon and how does that work? And I'm like, I don't need to know that yet. It's ages away. She's like, no, you need to know it now. And I'm like sitting there seething, like, I know you're right, but I'm still annoyed at you.
Yeah, she is. She does challenge you very much.
But I like that. That's what we need.
Yeah,
right?
Same. That's what we need. We do need.
I will include a link to Alexa's episode in the notes because it is definitely worth checking out. And she was also in our first episode of season 6, which was I've forgotten the title of it. Lessons authors wish they'd known before they published their first book. And there are some really juicy ones there. And she's probably going to say something you don't expect, actually. Hers was one of the most unexpected,
Always.
I think. Yeah, that's very true. You mentioned that you do an element of discovery writing when in between your midpoint and kind of towards the end. So can you just talk a bit more about that and how you got to find out that's what you need? And also if there's a place for discovering the entire thing and having no idea what you're doing until there are words on the page.
Yeah, there's a place for discovery writing. In fact, if I'm being frank, the whole plotting versus discovery writing thing is complete bullshit. I don't buy it. We're all, a plotter will sit down and they will outline and people will say, oh, you're a plotter. But then, like I've just said, you'll get to a point and you have to discovery write. A discovery writer sits down, and this is perfectly valid. I have no issue with discovery writing as a process, regardless of the fact that I've just written a plotting book. If that's what works for you and plotting genuinely doesn't work and you've tried it and it brings you out in hives or whatever, I'm not asking you to sit and force yourself to be a plotter. That's ridiculous. But what will happen when you discovery write is that you'll get to the end and then you kind of go back and outline based on that really long draft that you've written. So you'll be putting in those key story beats into your draft. You'll be shoring up your setting. You'll be making sure your character arcs flow properly. So you're just doing it in reverse. And I mean, I'll make an argument that it probably doesn't make the speed at which you write probably isn't affected by whether you're a discovery writer or a plotter. And I say that because when plotters talk about how fast they write, they often leave out the time they spend plotting. So they'll just be like, oh, I wrote this book in, I don't know, a week. Yes, you did, but you spent 3 weeks before that plotting. And a discovery writer might spend 4 weeks writing and then a week plotting. So it's a false dichotomy. I think it's really divisive. It makes tensions in the writing community really hard for those plotters who are ardent plotters that discovery writing is shit. And that's just not the case. There is a place for all of it because we all do a bit of both anyway. We're just doing things in a different order.
You mentioned then about doing the plotting up front and how that takes time and the editing up front at the end takes time.
Yeah.
And what I've certainly noticed, because I've done it both ends, I've done the crazy, ridiculous levels of editing after finishing the messy draft, and I've done something much more organized because I had the neater outline. And I have come to the conclusion I prefer to be stricter with my outline.
Yeah.
Because I just find it more fun and creative.
Yeah.
Because I almost see plotting as a separate entity to writing the story itself, and it's a different way to be creative. It's almost like creative problem solving, or how can I be a dickhead to as many fictional people as possible. It's like playing The Sims but without the AI.
Exactly. That is a perfect way to describe it. And I am a writer who hates writing. I actually hate the first draft. I love everything else. I love having written. I love the editing. I love outlining. So whatever I can do to get me through that first draft as quickly as possible, I'm going to do it. And for me, that happens to be plotting. That might not be the same for everyone, but yeah, it's like you said, it's like playing The Sims without the AI. You get to engineer a story where you're being horrible to your protagonist. You know where the story's going to go. And then for me, I can just sit down, get through the draft. The editing's a lot quicker. I can produce more books that way. So that's why plotting works for me. And I think once you find your own unique or semi-unique plotting process, it'll probably work for you too. And the thing I'd say to discovery writers who haven't tried plotting is that you won't lose anything by giving it a try. And you can always revert to discovery writing if it really doesn't work for you. Because I know some writers that it really, really doesn't work for, and they have tried multiple times to outline, but it just really does stifle their creativity. So have a go, and it, can't get any worse, can it?
Well, exactly. I think for me, like, it was because I wrote a draft of Hollywood Heartbreak and then needed to go through my first two books because I hadn't outlined them in enough depth or written down any key moments to be able to kind of check where the overlaps were.
Yeah.
And that was the scary, intimidating thing for my brain. And I know it sounds relatively small, but it felt gargantuan. It felt like scaling Mount Everest. My brain was so averse to it, and I cannot tell you how much stress it caused me. And actually, I ended up kind of enjoying reading them.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
It was cathartic and escapist, and I could read them objectively for the most part because the first book was published in 2016, and it made it then a lot easier to read the last two for the final Hollywood Gossip series, which let's call it a side project at the moment.
How many of those do you have? We've all got tons of side projects, right?
It depends. My main focus is the new series at the moment, and then I have like bullet points for the second book in that, and that needs to be outlined. I've got 2 Afterlife Calls books in progress because I got annoyed writing on the cruise ship and wanted to introduce some new characters, so went on to book 7. I need to outline book 8 in Afterlife Calls because I've only got half an outline for that. And then I've got Hollywood Romance, which is the last one. I did try being project agnostic for like July, August after I finished The Witch's Sacrifice, and I came to the conclusion that's not for me.
Yeah, so it's not for me either.
No, I can't do it because like it's more energy to decide which to work on. And that just is more stress. So if I'm like, okay, I'm writing this at the moment and I'm just going to write this, and I'm not even doing my 1,000 words a day at the moment like I normally do. What I'm doing instead is I'm writing like 4,000 words one day and nothing for 2 days, sometimes 3. But I'm still getting the words out and enjoying spending time with the characters and in Australia, and it makes me want to go back. And that's really what counts, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's another thing as well, another myth while we're talking about kind of plotting versus pantsing, that writing has to be needlessly difficult. Like we have to suffer for our art, and that is another piece of crap writing advice that I don't like. You should be enjoying it. And it doesn't matter whether you're writing 1,000 words a day, 500 words a day, whether you're plotting, whether you're discovery writing, the main thing is that you enjoy what you're doing. Because, if I choose to do this, if I really wanted to be miserable, I'll just stay in my day job. This is a choice. Nobody is forcing you to write anything. So just write in a way that you actually enjoy. And I think that gets lost in a lot of these discussions about process. Like, are you forcing yourself to follow a process that is making you miserable? In which case, it's not for you. It takes regardless of whether you write really fast or not, it takes a long time and a lot of decision fatigue to actually write a book. It's hard enough already without then hating the process or hating what you're doing. So yeah, just find a way that makes it enjoyable.
I'm curious to know, you mentioned you don't like the writing part of the process. So no, like, how do you get through that? Because that's probably one of the biggest parts, right?
Yeah, so coffee first. You need lots and lots of coffee to get through that. I think so. I'm going to talk about Clifton strengths. I don't know if anyone on your show has before, but I'm number one.
Sasha mentioned them before, and I think Becca Syme did as well, I think.
Oh, awesome. Cool. So I'm number one futuristic, which basically means I can see the end of a project in project terms before I've actually done anything to do with it. So I love the bit at the end. I think what gets me through the draft, aside from coffee, is the plotting itself, because I know where the story's going before I start. The scariest thing for me, and the thing that makes drafting really hard, is sitting down and not knowing what I'm doing, probably because of that number one futuristic strength. So that's not going to be the same for everyone. So if I have a plan and I know where the story's going, I can get through it a lot faster. And if I know key things about my characters and I already kind of relate to them because I've done that upfront work, I don't so much mind spending time with them. What I hate is when I haven't done any planning and I don't really know anything about the story and I'm just sat there staring at that blinking cursor for, hours, which doesn't really help anyone. If you can build up if you, like me, hate the writing process, the actual writing part, if you can do something that helps you build momentum and get through it as quickly as possible, that's what will get you through. Or just keep reminding yourself that the book will get written eventually, and then you can get to that, juicy editing part if you happen to like editing, which I know some people.
No. Well, I enjoy it more than I used to, but I think I prefer editing things that aren't fantasy to editing fantasy.
It's hard. Editing fantasy is really hard. I've actually written myself into a corner with the 5th book in my Myth and Magic series. So I've got to a point now where I've laid a breadcrumb at the end of book 4 that I'm going to have to pay off in book 5. And it's going to involve multiple timelines and flashbacks and flash forwards and reincarnation and all this stuff that I really don't want to tackle because it's going to be difficult. It's going to be tough. There'll be a lot to juggle. So yeah, fantasy is particularly hard, especially if you've started a magic system or something and now you're bound to stick to those rules, which is kind of what I've done, and I don't know how to get myself out of it. So that's going to take a lot of plotting. So that's where plotting comes in handy too. That's a good point. If your story is simple, so it's a single POV story, a very linear plot, then you probably won't need to plot in as much detail anyway. If it is a multi-timeline story with multi-POV and, I don't know, Game of Thrones style epic fantasy, for example, you're going to need to do, I would imagine, some plotting to keep track of all those characters and their arcs and things like that.
That's the real issue. Fantasy. I faced, actually not with fantasy initially, but with Hollywood gossip, just because there are 2 main characters in Hollywood gossip, but then you've got the antagonist, you've got the 4 characters from What Happens In who have the overlap with Hollywood gossip, and it's remembering who is where and when, and it was the timelines that really messed me up and stressed me out, because I'd written down a timeline of things like when people met and what their birthdays were, but I hadn't continued that into what happens in what happens in books. So that was where I had to go back and reread. And I think if I had continued my chart, which in hindsight I should have used a better software for, that was part of the problem, I would have found it much easier to do the draft of that book. Hindsight is a brilliant thing, isn't it?
It's fantastic.
Timelines are not.
No, timelines are the worst thing. Worst thing.
They are. I remember when I was working on The Mummy's Curse, there was a bit I wasn't quite sure on, but then I got notes back and it was like, yeah, you need to flesh this out a bit. And it was a subplot where one of the characters is being haunted by a poltergeist, and it was really hard for me because I'm not very good at subtlety. I don't know if you've ever noticed. But poltergeists start off very, very subtle, regardless of whether or not you believe in ghosts or not. There is a structure to it that ghost films and books and things also follow, and it's because the tension gradually escalates, and I hadn't done that, and so I was like, what am I meant to do? And I ended up actually treating that subplot like an entirely different story. So I plotted it out, and then I wrote the 10,000 words separately, like in a separate section of Scrivener, and then kind of pasted them into the book where I thought I fitted, and had to read through it and make sure it flowed. And it was actually right towards the end of the process, when I was reading it backwards, to proofread, I actually realized that I had injured my main character and in the rewrite and not included it in the further scenes that weren't part of that rewrite. And had I not read it backwards, I wouldn't have noticed that. So I think that definitely taught me a lesson as well. Clearly not enough of one, because my Aussie book still doesn't have that for the subplots. But that's an easier fix because it's romance.
Exactly.
And single point of view.
Yeah, much easier fix.
First time I've done
fix.
single point of view. First time I've done single point of view in 20 books.
Wow, that's incredible. At least you started with the hard stuff. I started the easy way, and now I'm adding more stuff in, and I'm like, oh, I've made this too hard now. I
started with third person close with 2 characters and then moved into 4. Wow. And then went into first person because actually I'm more comfortable writing in first person. But no matter how hard I try, no book has ever wanted to come out in single point of view until this one. And it does not make sense to have the love interest point of view in this book. And none of my others have ever been like that before. So it's really interesting experiment actually for me.
Yeah, and that's the case in point that every single book is different. So
yeah,
if you are outlining, the amount of plotting you're going to have to do might differ. And if you're writing a series and you've written, 7 books from a single protagonist perspective, for example, you're probably not going to need to plot as much because you know those protagonists really well already. So it's all a sliding scale. That's why I don't really believe in the plotting versus pantsing thing, because every project is different, every series is different. And I think the more you write, I think if you're writing your first book and you are sat there worried about, oh, is my plot good enough? Is this good enough? Is that good enough? It is only your first book, and you are going to get better as you write more books. So don't let a fear of following a process or not following a process stop you from moving on to the next thing. Because I'm sure Christina will agree, but the more books you write, the more you're guaranteed to know your process. I don't think you'll ever learn your process if you're trying to tinker with one book, to be honest.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. I always remember something Daniel Wilcox said that has just stuck in my head. And he said that all the learnings come from finishing the book, not like you have to be able to reflect back on the process, and you can't do that when you are in the process.
I agree, and I hate it that Dan's always right as well.
He does know his stuff though. He does. And he knows psychology as well. That helps.
He does. He is very wise.
We've asked you before a question about what book changed your life. So I've got potentially a harder question for you. I'm not sure.
Go for it.
I might know what you say, but maybe you'll surprise me.
Maybe.
What's one plotting technique that changed your life?
Oh, okay. So the one plotting technique that changed my life in terms of the plot itself, we've spoken a lot about character and stuff already, so I don't want to rehash that. But the one thing that has changed my plotting life in terms of the plot itself is the hook, or what I call the invisible question. And it took me longer than it probably should have to get my head around what a good hook actually is. So I define the hook, which is the first line you open your book with to get the reader to read on, as a question that you pose in the reader's mind using a statement. So you won't necessarily ask a question as the first line of your book, but you will pose a question in a way that doesn't make it sound like a question. So an example of this is from James Frey's young adult novel, The Calling, where he opens with Endgame has begun. Now, that's not a lot of detail, not a lot of words, but you instantly want to know, or the reader would want to know, what Endgame is. If the central conflict is happening, it's obviously happening inside the conflicts of Endgame, so we get a little information about the plot as well. So they're the types of really short, snappy statements that you can start a novel with that will allow you to hook your reader in. And if you can reveal something about character, plot, and setting at the same time, so much the better. So another great example is the opening to The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. And again, people will debate that book ad nauseum as to whether it's a good book. I personally think it's pretty good. So Dan Brown opens that novel with a museum curator staggering through an archway, and you immediately want to know, why is he staggering? Is he drunk? Is he wounded? Is there some other reason? And it's those little things that you can open a novel with that keep the reader reading. Because if they don't get past that first sentence, they're never going to read your book anyway. It doesn't really matter. So I think when I'm plotting in terms of plot, that is the most important thing that I focus on to actually get the reader hooked in. And that's probably the most valuable lesson I've learned, not just to open your novel with, a barrage of description that has nothing to do with the plot of your novel.
Or too much backstory.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Don't open any backstory, ideally. Like, just don't open with backstory. Leave it. And if you are doing backstory, drip feed it in. Don't do massive, as you know, Bob, this thing's happening. Nobody wants to hear that.
Yeah. I remember you talked to ALLi about that in your episode on writing beginnings, and I was like, ever since then, I've definitely been analyzing the hooks of books I read much more. Not intentionally, it's just been happening.
Yeah, once you know, you can't stop.
Yeah.
Once you know something, you can't stop doing it, can you?
Yeah, I remember when I did media studies at sixth form, I had a friend who was a year older than me who did it. And she said, you'll never watch a film the same way again.
Nope.
Been 15 years and I have never watched a film the same way again. Actually, it's been longer than that. But anyway.
Yeah, it ruins it. So if you are a reader thinking about becoming a writer and you don't want to ruin reading, maybe don't become a writer.
Yeah.
Because it does ruin it.
Yeah. And also when I started really studying plotting technique in heavy detail, because I didn't get taught that much about it when I was at uni. We did get some stuff like the 3-act structure and things. I may not have paid a huge amount of attention at the time. But since I've really started to study it more, like everything now is just really predictable.
Oh, yeah.
Even
and
games.
nobody wants to watch movies with you because you're the person that sits there going, oh, I know who the killer is.
Yeah.
I know who, So another thing, it will destroy your social life as well.
Yeah. ALLi is the only one who will watch stuff with me now because she doesn't mind that I do it because it's learning curve for her.
Yeah. You can watch stuff with other writers. We're
Yeah.
all happy to, if you find your writing community, go for it.
Yeah. My boyfriend is just like, stop. I know what you're going to say. Don't speak.
Don't ruin this for me.
Yeah. Yeah, we were playing a game and we don't very often play games together that are like in co-op. And I could tell how far into the game we were based on what was happening to these two characters. And he would be like reading the non-spoiler threads about like roughly how much time was left in the game. And he was like, oh, we're in this zone, so we're about halfway through. I'm like, I know, yeah. And he's like, how? I'm like, because the direction the story's going in. Because they thought they were at the end. They were thought they were reaching a success moment, and then everything went wrong.
Yeah.
It was never going to be that easy for them to achieve success. And he just kind of looked at me and shook his head.
Exactly that. So yeah, nobody other than other writers wants to do anything with you once you know how stories work, basically.
Yeah. But at the same time, it does still fascinate me, and occasionally they do surprise me. Most of the time they don't.
Yeah, but that's even better. If you find one that surprises you, then the payoff for you is fantastic.
That's true.
That's the best feeling. Yeah.
It is. So if our listeners want to find out more about you and your books and your podcast, where can they go?
So if you want to find out more about me, you can pop over to my website. That's swmillar.com. I am on Instagram and TikTok at swmillarauthor. And if you want to come check out mine and Cassie's podcast, you can head over to storytellersfaceoff.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us and talking all about plot.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me.
If you found this episode interesting or helpful, make sure you subscribe to The Writer's Mindset on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, or all of them. We don't mind.
Everything from a like to a rating to a review to a subscribe to shouting about us on social media helps us to reach more writers so that they can overcome the mindset issues that are holding them back with their writing too.
If you're on social media, come join us on Instagram at Writers Mindset Pod, or join our Facebook group, which you can find by searching for The Writer's Mindset.
And don't forget to come join us over on Patreon for our bonus series, Healthy Habits.
See you next time.
Keep writing.